All right, so we're gonna get started. Woo. So welcome to this short presentation overview within Research Expo. We are the Global Migration Center, and today we're gonna give you a little bit of a flavor of our research. We are a multidisciplinary center that studies human migration in the world, and three of us are here today to give you a little bit of a taste, as I said, of the research we do. In particular, thinking about how migration has changed in the COVID period and what's going to happen or what we think is interesting after COVID. I am an economist. My name is Giovanni Peri. I am the director of the center. And after me, Professor Ed Taylor, who's also an economist in the Agriculture and Resource Economics Department. We'll talk more about farm labor, migration, and COVID. And then after Ed, Professor Robert Irwin, who is professor of Spanish, will talk more about the human stories of migration at the US-Mexico border during the pandemics. He does research more on the human aspect and the narrative aspect. So let me tell you a couple of things of why our center all works and focuses on migration. Immigration in the US is a daily source of political and heated debate. And very often when you hear talking about immigration on the newspaper, the news, on the media, you focus on the word crisis. There is a migration crisis. However, migration is something that has been going on for a very long time and is actually an engine of US growth in terms of society, demography, economics, and it has been so for a very long time. I will give you a little bit of a flavor of why, of what migration is in the US. And then we'll say what happened since COVID started to migration in the US and what we are facing now in this post-COVID era and what can we do in the future. And when I talk about what can we do in the future, I will tell you about what the Global Migration Center does and how we think we want to be relevant. So here, the first thing that you show when you talk about migration is the percentage of Americans who are immigrants, who are foreign-born, first generation and second generation. And this is 120 years of immigration. And as you see, the US had a very large number of first and second generation immigrants around 1900. Then there were some strong reform of the migration system that made this decline dramatically. And then since 1960, the number of immigrants in the US has grown up, the stock, the total number. But if you see right now, first, immigration has a little slowed in the US in the last 10 years. And second, if you add first and second generation, we're not as many immigrants as they were in 1900. So we have been here in a sense. It's not new, the amount and variety of immigrants that the US is receiving. What is different, I would say now, is that now migration is a global phenomenon. So this is the zooming the last 30 years. And you see that as the percentage of immigrants has grown in the US, it has grown in all the rich countries of the world. Here I summarize this in Europe. So in the last 30, 40 years, migrants have been on the move all over the world, mostly from countries which are less rich into countries which are rich. And so when we talk about how the US deal with immigration, we're not going to talk about something which is specific to the US. This is happening in the world. Why most of the people migrate? Well, most of the people migrate because there are incredible economic returns to migration. Sometimes you are used to, or it's important sometimes to divide migrant between economic migrant and refugees, people who escape war or escape extreme persecution. But if you look at economic migrants, which are the vast majority of migrants in the US and in the rich world, 90% are economic migrants. This table gives you an idea of what type of economic gain people have if they migrate to the US from one of these countries. What does this number mean? This number means that an Indian, let's talk this, an Indian that comes to the US increases its yearly income by a factor of 6.25. So it will earn for the rest of her life 6 times what they will earn in India. And Haiti 10 times, Turkey 2.6, Mexico 2.6. This is a return, which is economic return, which is massive, is huge, compared to any other things that people can do that can increase their income. For instance, they can get a lot more schooling, a lot more educated in a developing country, but this will only increase their income by a factor of 3. Or they can move from a rural location to an urban location in their place. This will increase their income by a factor of 1.5. So you see that moving to the US is an incredibly a return with an investment with incredible return. However, also keep in mind this: who migrate to the US? And in general, who migrates to each country? This is a graph that shows you how more educated, so how more skilled in a sense, people who migrate are relative to people who don't. So this is a graph that shows the share of people with a college education among the migrants relative to the share of people with college education among people who don't migrate. And each dot is a country. So this dot means that people from India or who migrate, out of them, 70% have a college degree, but among people who stay in India, only 10%. So the flow of migrant is a flow, and the fact that it's above the 45-degree line means that for every country in the world, migrants are much more skilled and educated. So there is a massive flow of people looking for economic opportunity, many of which are very highly educated. And as a consequence of these facts, how many move, the US has access, as a consequence of migration, to a lot of foreign human capital, as economists say, a lot of foreign talent. The percentage of people in the US labor force who are migrant is about 13%. But among people with a college degree, more than 17% are migrant. Among people with a PhD in a science or technology degree, more than 33% are migrant. And at the very top of science, technology, innovation, research, there are many migrants. So on one end, you can think that this type of migration is an incredible engine of world growth, of world innovation, of world creativity. And that's in part what we're thinking about. There is not only this migration, there is also a migration of a lot of workers, a lot of people who just bring much simpler skills. But in this frame, what happened with COVID? So I want to just point out 3 things that happened with COVID, which I think are going to affect the way we look at migration in the future. First, I'm going to show you the number of immigrants during COVID collapsed in the United States. We have had actually 2 years of lost immigration in the US through COVID. Second, we have learned the importance of immigrants, not just at the top of science and technology, that we knew, but also the importance of immigrants in those sectors that we called during COVID essential, which are healthcare, food provision, that we cannot operate without. And these people were allowed to operate even during COVID. And finally, we have learned, sorry, this was this. And finally, if you look at the newspaper today, the word of the day in the economics is shortages. There are shortages of workers. Some sector cannot find worker. And I will show you how missing so many immigrants is going to be one of the reasons why this is going on. Okay, just through graph to clarify. This is the growth of foreign-born in the US, in the working age population of the US from 2010. And then look that this was a positive trend. And then around 2019, a little before, and then during COVID, this number just collapses. Immigrants not only don't keep coming anymore, there is actually a reduction in the total number of immigrants in the US. Why? Because the visa were not processed by the embassy. Nobody could travel. People could not come. If you had an H-1B, if you had an F visa and you were a student, you could not come to the US. So all these people were not there. Of course, this is projected up to March 2022. But essentially, relative to where we were, this graph says that we have lost about 2 million of immigrants in the last 2 years. What did we learn about immigrants in essential sector? So here is the percentage of immigrants, let's focus on California, who are in 4, which were considered essential sector in terms of operating of the economy during COVID. Agriculture, food chain provision, distribution of goods and people, and healthcare. This is the percentage of immigrants. On average, in California, there are 30% of the labor force is immigrant. But in this sector, they are overrepresented. Of course, everybody will know, and Ed will tell you much more, that agriculture in California is the labor force is foreign-born, but also healthcare. More than 35% of healthcare workers are foreign-born. Also, food provision from production to distribution is very heavily foreign-born, and the same in the United States. So we have seen during COVID that immigrants play a crucial role in the U.S. economy. And here, last graph, if you look at a correlation between across the sector, how many immigrants as a percentage there were in the labor force, and how bad are the shortages, this is a measure of how large the shortages, you see this positive correlation. So sector which had a lot of immigrants have also really bad shortages in the post-COVID era. This is hospitality and food that hire a lot. And this correlation, of course, is only a correlation, but suggests that some of these sectors have lost a lot of these people and therefore are struggling to find workers in the recent period. So what? After COVID, what can we do? So our center is thinking and is trying to figure out what are interesting and important policies that could correct or adjust this. I listed here three. First of all, it's a long time that there are ideas to regularize immigrants. And I think, of course, given the need that we have for many of these workers, and given the impact that regularizing some of these DACA is the regularization program for young immigrants, this will generate a big economic boost. This would be a very good time to do this regularization. On the highly skilled and scientist and engineer, I showed you that how relevant are high skilled in the US. And again, if we have had more time, I will show you how constrained is the path to come in the US. So increasing the number of H-1B, which is the visa for high skilled, or green card for skilled worker will bring more talent in the US. For you guys, very interesting. For the students who are here, very interesting, important is if you studied in the US college degree and maybe a master, you should have a way of staying in the US also for working, while instead is very hard because this will generate a lot of human capital in the US. So in all of these things, what do we do as a global migration center? So first of all, we do research. We document these things. And I will show you, we publish about these things. We tell people that that's what you observe in the data. Second, we try to connect with policymakers and talk to them and say, you know, what we find, what is important, what are the important policies. We also try to connect with people who work with immigrants, people who are on the field. We involve students, like many of you, in by teaching some of the things of some of the results of our research, some of the analysis we do, and also helping us to do research in this. And then we try to engage the public debate, to put in a voice in this debate, which is not about just a feeling an idea, is a voice also about facts, telling the stories, telling the data. And here, just an overview. So for instance, recently, one thing that we did was this research and this published paper on what would be the economic advantage, impact on economic growth of legalizing, of giving a path to regularization for undocumented immigrants. These are pages of journal where we publish. Of course, sometimes publishing is not enough. You need to be a little bit more present. So we write policy briefs. This is a brief about the improvement that, as a consequence of DACA, which protected from deportation a lot of young immigrant, improvement that there are in health and the situation of immigrants. Recently, I was engaged in a podcast to talk about the Ukrainian refugees. Refugees is also another area where we work, different type of immigrant, but just as important. We try to connect. This is from a round table / dialogue that we had, talking about what is going on the US-Mexico border. Robert Irving organized this. He is an expert, and we try to reach out with this information and this kind of sensitization to a policymaker. Of course, we want our students and our faculty then to talk about their research. This is a poster from this symposium that we have every year, in which we bring together the research, much of it done by graduate students and our affiliate, on many aspects of immigration. This is a paper looking at opinion of about the crossing of the border and immigrants. And then we try to have a social media presence. We are on Twitter, we are on Facebook, and even this is done by students. And again, maybe there are here the students who help us to run our social media, because again, we believe that research, information, knowledge in this area is extremely important. And so that's what I wanted to show. If you want to connect with us, these are the way of doing it. We have a newsletter every week that you can sign up for to know about all our activity. And if you follow us on Facebook and on Twitter, you will be updated on what we do. And that's all my presentation. I leave the floor to Professor Ed Taylor to talk about farm labor and immigration. Thank you.
While it's getting set up, I want to thank Giovanni not only for putting this together, but also for putting the Global Migration Center together. I mean, that is a huge resource for UC Davis. And so whether you're faculty, undergraduate students, graduate students, please follow what the center is doing and make use of those resources, because I don't know of another university around that has something that's really comparable to this. It's really great to see all of you who are here, and also those who aren't here, because I understand that we have some a fair number of Zoom connections as well. What I've been asked to talk about specifically is migration and US agriculture. This is an area in which UC Davis indisputably is the world leader and has been for a long time. It already was when I came here. I won't tell you how long ago that was, because it's just been so long now. But I stepped into that and logically started thinking about this. And now we have new generations of UC Davis graduates, PhD students, who are faculty members in other countries around the country, bringing this expertise to them. Here are 3 of them with whom I continue to collaborate constantly, and some of what I'll share with you came out of collaborations with them. So Giovanni's already mentioned, and you already know, living in California, that the farm workforce is an immigrant farm workforce, especially in California. This is for the US, that huge pie slice, it isn't even a slice, the blue there is all the immigrant share of the US farm workforce. And in California, it's a lot bigger. So, and if you think about who the new workers are, the new young workers going into farm work, they are virtually 100% immigrant workers, certainly in California. Nobody else is filling that farm workforce. So we've known this for a really long time. This is nothing new. But not too long after I came to UC Davis, I also teach development economics. And one of the basic facts or features of developing economies around the world, and historically of the US and Europe and high income countries, is that as incomes go up, here on the horizontal axis, you have per capita income, right? The share or percentage of the workforce in agriculture drops. Okay, so each one of these arrows is a different country. The origin of the arrow is where that country was in 1990. The tip is where it ended up in 2011. Okay, no, more recent than that. This is now, we brought that up to 2018. And so you can see each one of those arrows is sloping downward. That tells you that over time, these countries got richer. Countries around the world grew, their incomes grew, and the share of their workforce in agriculture dropped very sharply. Also, where the arrows are, where they're positioned tells you a lot. Because if you look way, way up in the northwest corner there, you have countries like Burundi in Africa, very poor, 95% of the workforce in agriculture. Down here in the southeast corner, you have rich countries, high income countries. One of these, I think, this curve right here is the US, which continues to slope downward, but now we're at a point where only, 1.5% of the US workforce is employed in agriculture. And they overwhelmingly are immigrants, right? So we have this immigrant workforce. So do you see a tension emerging here? Our agriculture depends on immigrants coming overwhelmingly from Mexico. Income in Mexico is growing over time, like in other countries around the world. As income grows, kids don't grow up to be farm workers anymore, right? People move off the farm. And so that kind of tension troubled me for a while. And then we decided, a colleague in Mexico and I decided to launch a study to see if that really is what was happening, right? Is it the case that young people in Mexico aren't growing up to be farm workers the way they were before? Because if that's true, we have a problem in the US. And so do farms in Mexico, which, as you know, grow a lot of export crops for the US and a lot of food for their own population. So this is the narrative that I want to share with you as the core of this talk today. Mexico basically saved the US in the mid-1900s when our young people stopped growing up to be farm workers. I didn't know anyone who wanted to grow up to be a hired farm worker, right? I mean, some people wanted to have their own farm. That's a different thing. We're talking hired farm workers here. But fewer people in rural Mexico, we suspected, would be growing up to be farm workers over time. And so we launched this project, which is called the End of Farm Labor Abundance Project, named after the title of the first paper that we published out of that project. And it just sort of snowballed in lots of different ways that I'm going to tell you about a little bit about that. Now, more recently, so what I'm going to show you is that that's true, that is happening. Fewer people in Mexico are going into farm work, and that's creating some big problems for farms in the United States. The pandemic seems to have accelerated this, and other things may be accelerating it too, including climate change. So we're going to touch on those things. So 3 areas of research that I'm just going to kind of dance around among. First of all, how do we show that the end of farm labor abundance is here? That fewer people in Mexico are going into farm work, and that the US agricultural system, farmers, have to brace for a new world in which they have to produce more and more food to feed the world with fewer and fewer workers than we had before. What does this mean for US agriculture? And I'm going to share a couple of things at the very end, which are where we're going right now, a couple of projects, one in particular that I'm really excited about in this world of new challenges, okay? So I'm going to kind of put the cart before the horse. The finding, we found a declining farm workforce in rural Mexico and declining farm labor migration from rural Mexico to the United States. And when we started doing that, you can see the thirst there was out there for those findings, because newspapers around the country started running articles about these UC Davis findings in collaboration with universities in Mexico. So what do you see? Washington Post was one of the first ones. We're running out of farm workers. Immigration reform won't help, right? If immigration reform makes it easier for people to come here and do farm work, well, that doesn't help if people don't want to do farm work, right? If people are, because like in the US, people can move from state to state freely, but that doesn't solve California's farm labor problem. It's that people in the US don't want to do farm work like they did before. What else is happening? Tight market for farm hands. Farm workers are aging, right? As fewer young farm workers come in, that means the workforce becomes older over time. And then we have these heat issues connected with climate change that are also a big concern here. So we continue to kind of pump out this research with students here, undergraduates as well as graduates, and it continues to get a nice spotlight out there and have some impact. So how do you test whether fewer and fewer people are going into farm work in a country like Mexico? What we did was we carried out a national rural household survey, random sample of households across all of Mexico. So we actually have a representative sample of the rural Mexican population. These dots are the villages that were randomly drawn for this survey. And you can see they're scattered all around rural Mexico. So we carried out this survey in 2003. Then we went back again in 2008, same households again, and then again in 2011. So that creates 3 observations on each household. But better than that, for each household, we made a list of all the family members and went back and constructed migration life histories for each one of them. So we know for each of your sons and daughters, no matter where they were at the time of the survey, whether they worked in the US at any time, every single year. We took that back to 1980 in the first survey. In the second and third surveys, we overlapped and did things to deal with memory recall bias and things like that. But we ended up with about 250,000 person year observations of data here. So really big data set for a representative population in Mexico. What do you do with so much data? You estimate an econometric regression equation, which we won't spend time on, but basically what we want to do is try to explain the left-hand side variable, which is whether or not people do farm work as a function of these right-hand side variables. And the key one is what year it is, right? What's happening over time. Is that, what is it, a beta 1 multiplying the time variable? Is that positive or negative? If it's negative, it tells us that the likelihood of doing farm work is going down over time. Well, it certainly was. And it not only was overall, we found it to be negative in each one of Mexico's 5 big census regions. So there's no place to go to find new workers in Mexico because this downward trend is happening everywhere. We then asked, why is it happening? And so we decomposed it into all these variables that explain the negative trend. And so starting at the bottom, we have expansion of jobs in Mexico. Oh, you can go work in factories. You can work in services, right? Expansion of employment explain a big part of the negative trend. Education. The average rural Mexican, my age, has about 5.5 years of education. The average rural Mexican, your age, growing up in a village in Mexico, that is most of you who I see here, has more than 9 years of education. And probably a smartphone, probably a Facebook account. It's a different world now. And people in villages complain that their kids don't want to do farm work, okay? What else? Birth rates. Did you know that the fertility rate in Mexico now is about the same as in the United States? It's a remarkable convergence that's happened over time. Around 2 kids per woman, right? It's amazing. So all of these things, that means there are fewer kids being born who potentially could become farm workers in Mexico or in the United States, okay? And then there are a few things that have the opposite effect, that kind of stimulate people to go into farm work. One of them is increased border enforcement along the border in Mexico. That kind of traps people in villages in Mexico, and they're more likely to do farm work. US farm wages make people who come here more likely to do farm work. And as labor shortages happen in both Mexico and the US, farm worker wages tend to go up in both places, right? So this kind of captures both those things. Okay, so what does that mean for US farms? Wages are going up. Real wages on US farms are going up. How much? We did a study to see how much wages would have to go up on US farms to keep there from being labor shortages, given that young people in Mexico aren't going into farm work the way they did before. And we found that wages would have to go up over a 10-year period by about 10%, but that's in real terms, adjusting for inflation. So when you look at the inflation rate, that means nominal farm wages would have to go up by just over 30%. But that study was done a couple years ago. And what were today's inflation numbers? 8.5% again, right? So we're talking about farm wages going up a whole lot as a result of this, just to keep things even. So it isn't going to happen. There have to be other responses. I'm a believer in going out and doing the fancy econometric studies, but also talking to people, doing surveys, asking farmers, well, you know, do you have labor shortages? And what are you doing about it? So this is something we did with the California Farm Bureau Federation a couple years ago. We asked farmers about this. 61% said they were using farm labor contractors to try to find workers. Most 86% said they had raised wages. 56% said they had adopted labor-saving technologies, like these new robotic solutions that are being developed at UC Davis and other places. I mean, this is really the future of agriculture. It's fewer farm workers producing more food with great new technologies, like we're seeing developed here. Okay, and some are switching acreage and a few other things. So this is another arm of the research. What are the responses there? How about the pandemic and other shocks? Well, Diane Charlton, who was a student here and is now a faculty member at Montana State University, she found this large positive association between farm work and new COVID cases, which raised some really interesting questions, right? Why is this happening? Is it the close proximity that farm workers live in? It was more likely to happen for farm workers who work for farm labor contractors, who are carting these workers around in close proximity with each other and so forth. Giovanni's already mentioned that COVID restricted migration flows across the borders, and so that helped prevent new workers from coming in to work on farms, the ones that were willing to do that. And then we have also found that incidences of extreme heat connected most likely with climate change in Mexico increased migration out of rural areas in Mexico, while having these negative impacts on crop production there. I won't need both those minutes. No, just kidding. I'll use them. And then who knows what else will happen. This is what Great Britain is dealing with right now. They have lost much of their farm workforce because it was Ukrainian, all right? That isn't to say that we're predicting something like that will happen in south of our border, but you never know what these shocks will be. And what they do, whether it's a pandemic or climate change or some other kind of unexpected political or civil strife shock, is they compound this big problem that's already there. The backdrop of this whole thing is that over time, fewer and fewer people are going into farm work anyway. So farmers have to compete with each other, Mexican farmers with US farmers with other US farmers, and all farmers with non-farm producers, right? To claim that ever smaller immigrant workforce. So what's next on the agenda? I'm just going to mention these two studies. One of them is a survey, a new one that we actually just finished. I wanted to share some results with you, but I can't yet because we haven't shared them with the California Farm Bureau Federation. And so I can't do that, but I can tell you that this is a new study of how farmers in California are adapting to the COVID pandemic, as well as to labor shortages. So COVID then, adds on to this problem that they were already dealing with. And we're now going national with this survey, it seems, through contacts that the Farm Bureau has with others. So I'm really excited about seeing these results. Actually, I've seen some, but I'm not supposed to tell you that, and sharing them with you. That should happen pretty soon. This last one, which I'm very excited about, is, look, so here's our big story. The number of farm workers is dwindling over time. It's getting smaller and smaller over time. Overwhelmingly, the reason is that young people are not growing up to be farm workers the way that they were before. So think of the total farm workforce out there, the flow from Mexico over time, as being this sort of floodgate that brings workers into the US. What happens after that? They migrate around, they settle, they choose where to work in agriculture, and they also decide whether to be migrant farm workers, meaning they move around and follow the crops. Maybe they start in the San Joaquin Valley near here at the beginning of the season. Maybe they end up picking, apples in Washington State at the end of the season. There are these internal migrant flows that go all up and down the Atlantic seaboard, up through the middle of the country, picking those blueberries up in Michigan and so forth. That migration process is what redistributes that large farm workforce across space, right? Across states and within states from one place to another. And I've always wanted to really dig into that, right? On a very fine level. Here we're going to be doing it at a 5 arc-minute level. So you're talking about what at our longitude, we're talking 6 to 8 square kilometers. So we're going to be modeling the agricultural production within what we're calling labor sheds, right? Farms are in watersheds, which are determined by physical features. They're also within labor sheds, which are determined by migration, people's willingness to move around. So we're identifying what these labor sheds are. And we're also, we also have hydrology in this model that we're doing, and we're taking it down to this very, very fine grid level. And with that, we hope to be able to learn some things about, not only migration and its role in redistributing labor across farms, what happens when you have fewer migrants over time, where are the places that are going to be most affected. When a lake dries up here in the Sierras, the fingers of the lake going up those valleys dry first, and you're left with a puddle in the middle, which is where all the boats are right now, right? Those houseboats. And we're wondering if something similar happens with labor when fewer and fewer workers are out there. If you're a farm that's on the main migrant circuit up the middle of California, maybe you'll be okay, at least long enough to get robots into your fields, new robots from UC Davis. But what if you're way up on the fringes somewhere? What are you going to do then, right? Is your labor supply going to dry up? And then similarly, water conservation efforts and things like that. If you're enacting water conservation measures, as we are in California because of the drought, how does labor affect that, and how does that affect labor, right? Does the labor simply move somewhere else? Do the workers go somewhere else? Or are they not so mobile? We have evidence that farm workers are becoming much, much less mobile over time, much less willing to follow the crops and migrate over time than they were before. So it's sort of a double whammy. The total number of migrants out there is going down, and the migrants who are here are less likely to move around. And we're hoping to really get a handle on that through this new study. So we have a website, farmlabor.ucdavis.edu, if you want to jot it down. And you can see a lot of resources there, a lot of links to different studies that we've done, articles from around the world, lots of different things. We thank you for letting me share this with you.
You setting that up. My name is Robert Irwin. Thank you all for being here. It's really exciting to be here. The Global Migration Center was founded beginning of 2020, right as the pandemic was about to hit. And so we haven't been able to do a lot of public events like this. So it's exciting to be here on campus with a live audience and being able to show some of what we've been doing at the Global Migration Center. I was not supposed to be presenting today. A member of our team, Maria Jose Gutierrez, was, but for health reasons, she couldn't be here today. So I'm taking over. The project that I coordinated is called Humanizing Deportation. So I'm coming at you from the humanities, different perspective from the previous presentations. This is a project that's been live for going on 6 years, and is a large audiovisual archive of migrant testimonies. We have nearly 400 migrants who have vulnerable migrants who have shared their stories with us. We started working with deported people, and since the age of the caravans, 2018, we started also working with migrants in transit, asylum seekers. We've worked with undocumented immigrants in the US. I encourage you to take a look at our website if you don't know it. What I'm going to talk about today is what we're working on now, which is the problem of COVID during in migration processes. And this is a kind of a public health oriented project. A lot of people wonder, were people migrating? Why were they migrating when, like, I'm afraid to leave my house, I'm afraid to go to the grocery store, and yet people are migrating across distances, dangerous places, arriving at a border that's shut down where no one even will allow them to seek asylum. What's going on? And so we obtained grant funding to work on this with El Colegio La Frontera Norte, and a lot of the work that we've done, about half the stories in our archive were produced in Tijuana, and so that's kind of the center of where we work, and one of the largest border crossing sites. And so we actually have been working on this for a while. During the pandemic, it was pretty hard. Most of the work we do needs to be on site. We need to form relationships with people and kind of help them develop the stories that they want to tell. We had to work remotely for about 1.5 years, but we did produce some stories that way. And since last summer, we've been back in the field and have had field work kind of very actively working on this project since February. I wanted to mention that our team is very diverse. And so we have faculty. This is just for this COVID project. And I said we've been working since 2016 with a much larger group of people, but with faculty, we have postdocs, graduate students, undergrads. We don't send undergrads to the streets of Tijuana, but we have a lot of undergrads who help us remotely working on things that we need related to transcriptions, translations, data analysis. And so we have a lot of them at UC Davis who are currently working with us. Conditions at the border are difficult for migrants who are trying to get to the US. There's an accumulation of migrants there. Some of them were there since before the pandemic. They haven't been allowed into the US. And many of them are from Mexico and Central America, but a lot of them have arrived from Haiti, different parts of South America that we didn't used to see in Tijuana. There were even Ukrainians there for a little while, and apparently they allowed them to cross, and they are no longer arriving in Tijuana, but there are other Eastern Europeans there. If you can imagine, things happening when you're migrating, and then there's like a stay-at-home order. But like you don't have a home. Your home is like in another country that you left. You're hoping to reach a new home. Migrant shelters, which are places that house people, usually temporarily, and they try to fit as many as they can into a small space. How do you maintain healthy distancing within a migrant shelter during the COVID pandemic? There are all kinds of things that people were really concerned about that were happening that we've been trying to research. There's been a border camp that migrants set up at the Tijuana border, thinking that one of these days the border is going to open and they need to be right there. The camp was really dangerous from a public health perspective because there was no way to manage distancing of people living outside in the elements. And there were also organized crime who were infiltrating the camp. They finally shut it down in February. But we've worked a lot on this kind of phase of our project, which is the 5th phase that we've been through with Esther Morales. She's a deported Mexican. She was actually deported 9 times from the US and until she finally settled in Tijuana. She has a tamaleria there. She makes a small restaurant that makes mainly tamales. And during the pandemic, she started working with a legal services organization, Al Otro Lado, taking food to shelters. Shelters needed to be shut down. Some of them were in quarantine. And so she was producing her food. No one was coming to her restaurant. And so she was going out to shelters and also to people on the streets, many of whom were migrants, to give them food. And so we've started actually working with her, which gets us into migrant shelters where we had never worked before, and with a lot of confidence with people who love her there. And so because she's given them food when they needed it. We also brought a team of law students from UC Davis Law School to Tijuana to offer legal advice to migrants, including asylum seekers. And this is another way where we've gotten kind of more deeply embedded into the community there. We had previously worked a lot with deported people, some with migrants in transit who are moving through, and so they don't really have roots there. And since we've been working more with asylum seekers, we've been kind of establishing our roots in different ways. It's been interesting, we're called Humanizing Deportation. Some people think we're an NGO, but most people know that we come from UC Davis and that we are there to document stories that the world doesn't know about. A few of them that we came across, and this is a Guatemalan migrant who I never met. We produced an entire video through communication on WhatsApp. And he had been deported to Guatemala, was afraid of violence there, but also he had a partner who was a US citizen, but living in Guatemala, who ended up with stage 4 cancer. She needed to come to the US to get the medical care she needed. He wanted to join her, and he was in Tijuana. trying to cross the border. We made a story, a digital story about him where he tells about his plight, waiting in Tijuana to get a chance to try to make his case to come back to the US. This is a migrant that we actually met in Ecuador. We had Maria Jose Gutierrez, who was going to present today, did fieldwork this summer in Ecuador with migrants. And this guy has an interesting story that he had never contemplated migrating until COVID hit, when he lost his job and the economy shut down in Ecuador. And so he decided he's got to migrate. And so he migrated, got to the US border, crossed, he got caught, was put in a detention center where he caught COVID and was stuck in the US in quarantine for a long time before they just deported him back to Ecuador. And that's when she met him. That's one of the stories that we have. Another story is of a family from Michoacan, from a town in Michoacan, which is an area where there's a lot of violence, drug-related violence nowadays. And this family fled the violence. They were terrified for their lives and came to the border in Tijuana hoping to cross over. And this is kind of the more typical story that we hear, is that people who will tell you their story, and we are curious about, oh, well, what happened during COVID? And it's like, well, COVID, yeah, okay, well, there was COVID, but I was migrating for this reason, and this is what happened to us. And then she mentions, oh yeah, and my husband had COVID, and we were living in a tent, and we had to take care of him while he's living on the floor, practically outside, but he got better and he went back to work, and now we're here waiting for our chance to make our asylum claim. And this is kind of the stories that we hear most often. And so I don't have really a deep analysis of this now because we have the field work kind of ongoing, and we won't really be analyzing formally the data until the end of the summer. But some of the things that we have discovered is that COVID has actually created a burden that has caused some people to migrate. And so yeah, Kamala Harris can say, well, don't come. But if people have strong reason to come, then they're going to come. And it could be for economic reasons. There's a Honduran couple, a gay couple that we met, who during the stay-at-home period when the economy was shut down in Honduras, they felt much more exposed than they had previously because people didn't notice them when everyone was working and going about their lives. But when everyone was staying at home and they would only come out to go to the grocery store, people started staring at them. They felt much more in danger, and that's why they migrated. But the vast majority of the cases we found are people have very little to say about COVID, that it didn't affect their migration decisions. They're migrating for other reasons. If COVID is happening or if it isn't happening, they needed to migrate because they feel that they're in danger because of a climate crisis, whatever reason they're migrating. And that the border closures have not discouraged migration. People keep coming and keep coming and keep coming. And so that's kind of the state of things in Tijuana, where there have been illnesses, and people will talk about illness and then usually recovering. So most migrants are actually younger people. They're actually more healthy people. They're not likely to be people who are elderly or obese or whatever kind of health conditions are the ones most likely to cause COVID to be a deadly disease. Most migrants don't have it, and so they don't worry as much about COVID as some other people do. And the other thing is that I'll mention is that even though they are migrating and are in a very vulnerable state, and they don't have a job, they don't have money, they don't have any real kind of formal access to healthcare. For the most part, people who have fallen sick have gotten the care that they need. People were not complaining about lack of access to healthcare, and that there are robust care networks that kind of take care of migrants in places like Tijuana. I think it might be different in some other parts of Mexico. This is not the state. The Mexican state does do some of this, but a lot of it comes from church organizations and other organizations from civil society. So anyway, this is what we're finding out, and we're gradually processing it. Again, if you haven't seen our project, there are some really moving videos of migrants, of all kinds of migrants on this website. I encourage you to take a look at it, watch a couple of videos. The migrants want their stories to be heard, and we do our best to get word out. So I hope you take a look at it. Thank you very much for your attention today.
Thank you, Robert. So we have just about 10 minutes if there are some comments or questions from you guys for us about, you have had a little bit of an idea of the breadth of our research, from quantitative focused on the economy, the science, the agriculture, and to more human, more witness. So any question or any comment for any of us? You raise your hand and a mic will get to you if you have a comment or a question.
Hi, can you hear me okay? No. So this is for Robert. So May 22nd, they're going to be lifting the Title 42 restrictions, and it's going to be chaotic. Republican Party is going to take advantage of the images that we're going to be seeing at the border. So I'm wondering, it's on the Tijuana side, if there's any sort of preparation going on for what's likely to take place?
I'm sure that there's lots of preparation going on. I really don't know what form this is going to take. So there's this fear that they're going to drop Title 42, which means that they're going to allow asylum seekers to come to the border and start applying for asylum again. It's not clear to me, or I haven't heard a clear explanation of how they're going to manage that. And so what was happening prior, there were like all kinds of different ways that the kind of a large number of migrants at the border would be managed. And there's a metering system where a small number would be allowed to cross the border and have a credible fear interview on a daily basis. And they all signed up to a long list and had a number, and they would go on the day that they were supposed to go. Also, the Migrant Protection Protocols, otherwise known as Remain in Mexico program, is actually active since a while ago. And so we know some migrants who are actually enrolled in that program, who are not the ones like that that used to be enrolled in that program, who were from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America and Mexico. We've met Nicaraguans and Colombians who are enrolled in migrant protection protocols. We don't know how that program is going to be deployed for the migrants who are waiting in Tijuana. I don't think there's going to be like a mass of people running to the border. I think that they're going to have some kind of way of managing it. Unfortunately, what the management means from the migrants' perspective is that they're not going to cross the border on May 22nd. They're going to be there waiting months and months and months, just as migrants who were trying to cross legally prior to that have been. They're also talking about deploying deportation. I remember that Mayorkas made a point of that. And so I don't know what's going to happen to migrants who cross on their own without being invited and crossing at one of the legal points, but like jumping the fence. It's not also clear to me how they're going to be taken care of, but I imagine that with all of the anti-immigrant rhetoric and fear of kind of dropping Title 42, that the government, I think, is going to respond more harshly than we maybe would like them to. But anyway, it's really, who knows what's going to happen.
Thank you for your presentations. I wondered if each of you could talk a little bit about student opportunities. So you mentioned that students get involved in the projects and at the GMC. Are the data that you've collected, Humanizando la Deportación and ENHRUM and the other data projects that you mentioned, Ed, available also for student research projects, and how do people go about accessing them and using them?
Yeah, we just hired a group of students to help us for the running of the center for social media, and they are very important. So on that side, yes. In terms of research that my group does, the help from undergraduate students is a little bit more limited. We employ a lot of graduate students, actually. So I let Ed and Robert speak.
Well, there are definitely undergraduates here who can deal with that equation I showed you. But for the most part, that kind of research gets done by graduate students working with us. However, the data collection that we did in Mexico, I mean, we literally put, hundreds of students in the field. A number from UC Davis, most were from, 15 universities all around Mexico. They were in the field together, working on these projects, and it was very exciting. And then I've had undergraduate honors theses, and yes, the data, we're an open book. We are really into open source stuff. And so if people are interested in having access, say, to the National Rural Household Survey data from Mexico, or you know, you are kind of beholden to people who are supporting your research, like the California Farm Bureau Federation. We have to be really careful about, you know, raw data being released there. I mean, this is always a problem when you're doing some research projects. But as far as we are able, we definitely make this available to people who are interested. So, yeah.
Yeah, the Humanizing Deportation Project has a constant group of volunteers, undergraduate volunteers, who work with us in different on different kind of small tasks that they can carry out during the academic year or over the summer. And so we'll be doing kind of new recruiting as the academic year ends. And in addition, our archive is a public archive. It's on the web, and so it's available for anybody who wants to do research there. So a number of undergrads and grad students have used the archive for research. We can help people if they need help with a certain theme, or some people have wanted to have transcripts of the audio-visual files that are there that we have on hand, and so we can give them to people if they want to use them.
So sorry, they are telling me that there are a couple of questions online, and I think we one question and one online, and then we're closing. Thank you.
Hi. So I really found it interesting what you mentioned about local food production, and I'm actually leading the UC Davis team in the semifinals of an international urban greenhouse challenge, and we're focused on designing sustainable local food systems for low-income neighborhoods. And I was wondering if there's any insight that came up from your research regarding migration and labor patterns specifically relevant to the developing industry of indoor farming.
That's a great question. I'm not aware of economics research that's been done specifically in that area. I think it's really interesting. I'd love to learn more about it. Yeah, it's a great initiative.
One there, Giuseppe. Yeah, that's okay. Any more? Or yep.
Refugee populations. Are there any like highlights of research you'd want to share about that, or is that?
So that's a short question, but the answer is very long. So I have worked, the group has worked with many different types of refugees. Ed has a lot of work with African refugees in Africa. I have a lot of work with Syrian refugees in Europe and Bosnian previously in Europe. So we have a lot of results. In my research look at what policy for integration of refugees have worked better, which one have been the group who have been successfully integrated, where there are the problem, how women refugees have had a very big issue in integration, how some type of refugees have had a hard time. I have studied refugees once they are resettled in Europe. I had studied a lot of refugees in camps, actually in refugee camps.
Yeah, I've done a lot of work in Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, on the refugee settlements, where we go in and we do surveys of refugees in these UNHCR settlements. We also do surveys in the host country communities surrounding the refugee settlements and try to get at the impact that hosting refugees has on the surrounding host country population. And one of the recurring themes that comes out of this is that countries can really do well by doing good hosting refugees, because that tends to create some positive economic benefits for surrounding host country populations.
Let me say a word about that too. And so I mentioned that we work with asylum seekers at the border. And so a lot of those people, maybe all of them, consider themselves to be refugees. What's really sad about that is that the statistics of people from, especially the countries that we most work with, Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, the percent, and Haiti as well, the percentages of asylum seekers who obtain asylum successfully from those countries is something like 25% or lower. And so that doesn't mean that they're not refugees, but it means that the particular asylum laws that we have in the US, as they apply to asylum seekers nowadays, don't align. It's really sad, but the law, the kind of thinking underlying the laws that we have in the US is from World War II. And they haven't been updated as they have in many other parts of the world. And so many people who I think are really refugees, who really are in danger, will not get asylum in the US.
Great. You got a little bit of an overview. I mean, you're a refugee in Europe, in Africa, and the US. Okay, I think we are at the end of the session. I want to thank you, all of you, for having stayed until the end, for the very interesting question. Most of all, for showing interest in the center. Any question you have, you can follow up. Thank you, and thank you, the Office of Research, for putting this together. Thank you.